on? There we go. Okay. The influential French sociologist Hippolyte Taine argued in his work, The Philosophy of Art, in order to understand a work of art, an artist, or a group of artists, one must picture to oneself exactly the general condition of minds and manners of their age. There lies the ultimate explanation. There is to be found the first cause which determines all the rest. And he goes on, just as naturalists study the physical temperature in order to understand the appearance of this or that plant, in exactly the same way must one study the moral temperature in order to explain the appearance of this or that form of art. Pagan sculpture or realistic painting, mystic architecture or classical literature, idealistic poetry or voluptuous music. The works of the human spirit, like the works of living nature, are explained only by their environment. Now, it can be said that these works of the human spirit, which for now we will interpret more narrowly as works of art, are determined by their environment at a few different levels of abstraction. I'm not interested in asking what art is in this lecture, but I will start it by asking, why do people produce and consume art in the first place? In a very broad and at the same time very simple sense, we engage with art because we enjoy it, because it stimulates our brain in peculiar but pleasurable ways. However physiologically correct this is, it's not a very interesting answer, nor does it explain very much about art as a real phenomenon. I think a more revealing answer is to be found in art's artifice. Unlike science or philosophy, which seek and present truth from the point of view of generality, art always contains an element of real individuality, whether on the part of the producer or the consumer, which excites life in spite of its abstraction. When I play Brahms's Violin Sonata No. 3 for you all later this evening, there will be three very concrete individualities asserting themselves. First, there is the individuality of Johannes Brahms as manifested in his notes and his performance directions. Then, there is my individuality as expressed through my choices of interpretation and performance. And finally, there is your own individuality that you as a listener project onto the piece. On the subject of this constant interplay of real individualities which distinguishes art from other intellectual activities, the Russian anarchist philosopher Mikhail Bakunin has this to say: art, then, is, as it were, the return of abstraction to life. Science, on the contrary, is the perpetual immolation of life, fugitive, temporary, but real, on the altar of eternal abstractions. So then, art comes into being when we run up against the limits on expression which confine philosophy and science. It enables us, even if just for a moment, to negate our finite subjectivity and gain insight into the universal, which for some is the divine, by finding real identity with an objectified other. In any case, the basis of art, the precondition of its existence, is philosophy or science, which, for all intents and purposes, are the same thing. Just as I asked why we do art, now I ask this: why do we do philosophy? Karl Marx says in the third volume of Das Kapital that all science would be superfluous if the outward appearance and the essence of things directly coincided. That is to say, in the remarkable diversity of phenomena that meet us in the course of our day-to-day lives, neither the real natures of such phenomena nor the real relationships that exist between them are immediately clear to the observer, and often they even appear upside down. A systematic understanding of the world, even if it is still incorrect to some degree, is necessary for basically every species to maintain its existence. Without such an understanding, there is only a collation of blind, disconnected inputs and outputs. The more practically correct and logically rigorous the system is, the more effective is the subjective activity of the knowing agent on the external world, because that agent can more consistently appraise relationships of cause and effect and adjust its approach accordingly. But if every animal needs some level of systematic understanding in order to maintain its species' existence, why is it that only humans have developed philosophy? In the first place, philosophy presupposes a certain level of social development of individuals. Before attaining that level, the struggle for existence frankly takes up too much collective effort for philosophy as such to become a generalized activity. High intellect requires easy access to resources. But even past this point, Without social interaction, there would not be an impetus towards philosophical thinking. So long as real relations between individuals remain accidental or occasional, there cannot be any movement towards self-consciousness. We recognize ourselves in a concrete way only by asserting ourselves over and against others, by coming up against the limitations of our finite individual existences. Ants, though much more social than humans, lack the physiological and productive development to support a high enough intelligence for philosophy, despite a relatively high level of communication. On the other hand, certain species of octopus, although in many cases possessing extremely high intelligences, lack virtually any sociality. Furthermore, from the standpoint of man as a species being, rather than just as a social individual, philosophy, in addition to art and other characteristically human pursuits, are part of a broader effort of humanity as a species to assert itself against the rest of nature. As it tries to separate itself from the universality of the natural world, humanity increasingly looks for a new path back to this universality in its own faculties of reason, but more on this later. We have established that the prerequisite of philosophy is a body of definite social relations, out of which it organizes a more or less rational framework for understanding both the social and the natural world. Although philosophy grows organically out of these relations, we also use philosophy reflexively to understand where these relations come from and why they are what they are. When philosophers begin to engage with these relations, they appear first as set facts, self-sufficient and static units of information, but as they investigate these facts more deeply and compare them against one another, they come to find out that these facts are essentially snapshots of a world that is constantly in motion. They are always changing. These facts do not and cannot posit themselves. How a fact is posited out of the development of the world of things is strongly conditioned by the specific developmental location in which the observer finds themselves. This holds on the social level just as much as it does on the individual level. Whether or not it consciously believes in a particular fact, if a subject conducts itself as if that fact were true, it is true in practice. And the same holds for society as subject. But subjective truth is not the same as objective truth, and either may be distinguished from absolute truth. Objective truth does not change according to whether or not it is believed by a subjective body, but subjective truth is always an accurate reflection of the relations of that subjective body to objective truth. Objective truths, in turn, move within the laws of absolute truth. In other words, individual objective truths are the particular manifestations of the absolute truth of being in its process of actualization. In line with Heraclitus and Hegel, the root of all movement in life is contradiction. As an object moves, it is both in a place and not in a place. As subjective truths come into contradiction with one another, they move towards an understanding of objective truth. This is the fulcrum of the Socratic method and also of what we call today the scientific method, for example. As objective truths, on the other hand, come into contradiction with one another, they represent the actualization of absolute truth. For instance, the Earth is constantly changing, but its formation and development proceed according to natural laws which assert themselves through that movement. The contradictory movement of the natural world is imitated by that of the social and historical world. As facts grow up out of atomistic individual experiences into molecular social ones, they do not lose their immediately subjective character, since they are nothing but the aggregate of subjective experiences. What they gain, however, is a level of systematic coherence which is generally not attainable for a single mind working alone. In this way, a society or a group within society builds up an ideology. The ideologies which circulate within a particular society grow more numerous and more varied as that society becomes differentiated within itself. Idest, groups with antagonistic interests which cohabitate in a given society find ideal justification for the furthering of their positions in the practical struggle for social existence over against others. As the material basis of society changes, that is, as the productive forces of society advance or regress, new social relations must form in order to make adequate use of altered techniques or technologies of production. For example, the dominant form of production in feudal societies of Western Europe was individual peasant production, according to which each individual social unit, in this case the household, owned its own means of production and produced largely for itself. The security of these individual small holdings were guaranteed by a class of nobility which supported an armed entourage to which the individual peasant households paid tribute. Accordingly, the legal systems of such social formations revolved around the virtually universalized individual private property and were grounded in the military organization of the ancient Germanic tribes that conquered the Western Roman Empire. That is, small property and aristocracy were the foundation of the feudal social system. From the 17th to the 19th century, this system crumbled in Western Europe, relatively peacefully in places like England and Amsterdam, quite spectacularly like France, for example. Although private property remained the cornerstone of the new order, the old ideals of duty and aristocracy were cast away, and in their place emerged ideals of liberty, equality, and brotherhood. This was not because people all of a sudden realized that equality is a more noble virtue than aristocracy, or that it is better to be free than serfed, but instead it was because the relations of the Ancien Régime no longer corresponded to the material organization of society. Let's take liberty as an example. Modern industrial production, as it exists in a market form of distribution, requires a mass of workers who are free to change location and vocation at essentially any point in time, as the market fluctuates and different sectors of the economy boom and bust. This is not possible for a peasant who, together with his family, is bound by duty and even by his own property to his land. Even the common denominator of both the old and the new regime, private property, underwent significant changes. Rather than property being a condition of duty, it was now a tool of freedom. It is again necessary for the correct functioning of a modern capitalist economy that the owner of private property can dispose of his property entirely as he pleases, so long as his doing does not interfere with the freedom of another to do the same. The peasant was not legally free to act in the same way. Furthermore, legal guarantees of property had to change with the emergence of a large working class which did not possess any private property of its own. It would be absolutely impractical for the employer of a large industrial enterprise to be required by law to ensure that each of his workers owned a portion of the enterprise and paid tribute out of their part. If one worker, for example, owns 6 gears in a particular machine while another owns 12 needles, how is one possibly to calculate compensation? In this way, modern capitalist society already begins to negate the institution of private property as the process of production is socialized. In any case, this is just one illustration of one way that social relations can change to reflect material changes in the economic base of society, and of how a new social group or class can come into being in order to fill new niches within that social ecosystem. When such a class develops for the first time, its ideological point of view is negative. It looks to negate the old mode of organization in which there is no place for it, or in which it is only of secondary importance to the whole order. For instance, the theoretical representatives of the German middle classes in the first half of the 19th century are known as the critical philosophers. Counted among them are the Bauer brothers, David Strauss, and other relatively minor names in continental philosophy. Their modus operandi was the rational demolition of all existing institutions and ideas without putting forth any suggestions as for what to do with those ruins as a matter of principle. This strategy obviously leads to impotence, but it makes complete sense when one looks at their conditions of class life. Germany at the time was deeply stagnant in a kind of late feudal system, while every country west of its borders was racing at breakneck speed into the modern age. And every attempt of the middle classes to make any real changes was met with, at best, a parody of reform. Patterns of thought mimic patterns of behavior. Once real relations begin to change, and in so doing, provide a window for a new class into its potential future, that class then begins to posit itself for itself, rather than merely contenting itself to negate the old order with which it finds itself in contradiction. It works consciously to change existing social relations to correspond to its own needs. Just as plants and animals are involved in a constant process of evolution, where traits that are better matched for a new environment are selected over those which are better matched for an old one, the same is true of social groups and classes. New classes whose interests correspond to the higher economic development of man are selected for by the force of history, just as much as each class shapes the way that that history moves forward according to its particular position. We are determined by our environment, but at the same time we make that environment for ourselves and for our posterity. While there is still a direct contradiction between the ideology of a particular class and the existing mode of social organization, the ideological and material struggle is a conscious one. But once that contradiction has been resolved and the ideology that presaged the resolution has been actualized in the form of its ideal social relations, it ceases to be a system of conscious and normative judgment and becomes instead an unconscious descriptive judgment of immediate facts. Ideology, once the inner psychology of the conscious class subject, becomes objectified over against that same subject as a particular social organization, expressed in its highest formulation as law. Earlier, I alluded to the principle that all social relations are necessarily comprised of individual subjects, even though those relations have an objective existence beyond the immediate perceptions of their component individuals. When I mentioned this the first time, it was in its positive aspect, as the real manifestation of the individual will as history and as society. Now, however, it is in its opposite role as the negation of the individual will by history and by society. To summarize Hegel's articulation of this process, true freedom is the recognition of necessity, the absence of freedom. We have established that for an individual in the modern world, necessity exists most immediately in the form of the relations of civil society. I can obtain personal security and means of subsistence only by entering into a network of social contracts with other people which have been predetermined for me by man's historical development. While the form of modern society is highly peculiar and in many respects quite strange from the standpoint of the rest of the natural world, its content is absolutely commonplace. In fact, we have already skimmed the full gamut of its form and content, since we have derived the most basic and immediate condition of life, the struggle for existence, from art, which is its most abstract condition. But in our descent from heaven to earth, we have proceeded only according to generalities. This was needed in order to achieve a unified conception of the subject at hand, to clarify the critical points of connection between the major levels of abstraction we're dealing with, but we've actually proceeded backwards relative to real life. The Gospel of Matthew tells us that man shall not live by bread alone, and true as this may be, we still need bread before we can live at all. Because man is by nature a social animal, much of what applies to the individual can be extrapolated to society as a whole. Before a society can build superstructures like art or politics out of itself, it must secure its basic existence and attain a certain plenitude of the means of subsistence and reproduction with which to support those superstructures. Professional artists and politicians, from the standpoint of subsistence economy, are useless idlers. So if a society is to include them in its composition, it must be able to ensure that it can provide sufficient food, shelter, protection, and so on to the entirety of the social organism, even without the immediately productive participation of those classes. In short, the division of labor and productive forces of society must be adequately developed before art can become a generalized feature of social life. At the beginning of this lecture, I said that 10's works of the human spirit are determined by their environment at a few different levels of abstraction. But now that we're on the other side of this movement, we can argue with greater clarity that art is the highest abstraction of real immediate life. Moving on from our general conception of matters, I would now like to proceed the right way around from earth back to heaven in specifics. Those of you keeping track of my citations will have no doubt noticed a Teutonic bias. References to 18th and 19th century German history and philosophers have thus far outweighed the others. This is the result neither of coincidence nor of personal preference, but of my choice of repertoire for this recital. The form and content of an investigation should correspond to its concept. Johannes Brahms was a 19th century German composer, so we shall look at him according to the cultural and philosophical form and content of 19th century Germany. Now, it has to be said, one cannot learn everything about an artist or an artwork by exploring their environmental and historical factors alone. At some point, one must interrogate these works on their own terms, on the basis of their abstract artistic content as posited or detached from their real development. In music, this usually means something along the lines of score study, harmonic analysis, etc. But one must also interrogate the artist in the same way. Personal biographical details can reveal much about the artistic choices made in one piece or another, or even in the whole corpus. But as interesting and useful as all that can be, I will not be doing any of it. You all can hear enough of this in the music as it already is. Instead, we will be looking at Brahms in abstraction from his immediate personhood as a world historic representative posited out of a material and ideological milieu in motion. The single most consequential event for our narrative, the Industrial Revolution, began in Great Britain around the middle of the 18th century. This was made possible by a confluence of several factors. Firstly, improvements in agricultural techniques dramatically increased food production, enabling the growth of large urban centers. Secondly, the political situation on the island was pretty tranquil due to its geographic separation, while its legal system was very friendly to business in large part as a result of the English Civil War. Finally, the rapid and expansive growth of Britain's imperial dominion, particularly in India, together with the predominance of mercantilist economic policies, created an extremely high demand for goods manufactured in Britain. From Britain, the Industrial Revolution spread to North America and the European continent, but this process of development was by no means even in all places. North America possessed many of the same advantages that Britain herself had had, and so industrialization in the main proceeded quickly and smoothly there. But the situation on the continent could not be more different. Where Britain enjoyed peace and plenty, the rest of Europe had been ravaged by near constant warfare for 4 centuries. Especially destructive for Central Europe was the 30 Years' War, on account of which Germany lost between 1 and 2/3 of its total population. By the time Germany entered the industrial race some 200 years after this war, it had still not fully recovered from the effects of conflict, famine, and plague. Since it lacked the prerequisites of general industry, the state of its manufacturers remained quite narrow, and in any case quite significantly behind the rest of Western Europe for decades. This stagnation in production was, as we said, reflected by a stagnation in social and political life. When Napoleon's armies marched through the Holy Roman Empire in their quest to spread the revolutionary wave across the whole world, they were met with a fundamentally pre-modern social order. Well into the 19th century, feudal relations predominated in virtually all of Germany, or at least what could be called Germany at the time. In place of the modern nation state, Germany was still fractured into dozens of miniature fiefdoms, principalities, duchies, and the like, with any kind of central imperial government being more aspirational than real. The imposition of the Napoleonic Code by the invading French revolutionary armies dealt a major shock to this increasingly fragile system. The patchwork of disparate feudal legal apparatus was swept away without warning. Although this did not last in its initial expression, the feudal material conditions of the German states could not support a modern legal code in its full spirit, and almost immediately after the French were defeated, the new code was abolished. It did spark momentum towards general social revolution in Germany. For reference, it is in the aftershock of these events that Johannes Brahms was born in 1833. The relative stability of the decades following the Napoleonic era could not last. On the one hand, the death blow to the feudal system that the French Revolutionary Wars dealt to the old regimes of the continent irreparably damaged their ideological and political basis. On the one hand, their real social and economic basis was also being seriously undermined by the Industrial Revolution happening across the Channel. The economic upsurge of the British Empire pulled the rug out from under the traditional handicrafts and small manufactures that formed the backbone of the German peasant economy. Growing discontent among the general population expressed itself only in sporadic and localized revolts until 1848, when a general economic crisis overtook Europe, due mainly to a British industrial crash and a poor European harvest, and revolution erupted in virtually every major European city. Although dissatisfaction was widespread among the rural peasantry and the crisis hit them the hardest, the backbone of the revolutionary forces in the more politically consequential cities in 1848 and 49 were intellectuals, artists, and students, which likely had something to do with the often quick and theatrical failure of those movements. Among the ranks of the German barricaders was the composer Richard Wagner, whose disappointment with the results of the revolution eventually led him to the anti-Semitic and arch-reactionary positions he is personally known for today. But because of his involvement in 1848, he forms a direct bridge between the artists who came out of it and the philosophers who inspired and made it. Some commentators have attributed much of the North European intellectual heritage to the long winters in the region. Before the internet or even electricity, there was not much to be done for months out of the year besides read, write, paint, compose, and so on. Whether or not this is really the prime mover of that heritage is debatable, but it offers a compelling analogy for the bloom of German philosophy between the 18th and 19th centuries. The social, political, and economic winter that froze German practical life during this period caused its greatest thinkers to turn inward and philosophize from the standpoint of the mind, that is, from the standpoint of idealism. This really began with Kant, and moved through Fichte and Schelling before reaching its apotheosis in Hegel. Hegel was the absolutely dominant philosopher of the early 19th century, no pun intended, both theoretically and institutionally. His high-profile professorships meant that he taught a huge number of students who would later become extremely influential in their own right, and the financial and moral support offered to him by the Prussian state caused his works to be disseminated rapidly and widely. Now, to adequately explain Hegel's outlook on philosophy would take another several hours, so I have time only for a grotesquely narrow summary. At its core, Hegelian philosophy is organic and systematic. It is concerned with deriving a complete and closed system from a single basic principle, and then demonstrating how the final proposition is both the cause and effect of the first. Hegel's entire standpoint is a response to the transcendental idealism of Kant. But where Kant's idealism is extremely stable based on definite and unchanging fundamental categories, Hegel's is constantly in motion and based incorrigibly on intentional internal contradiction and motion. One can see how the social stability of Kant's time gives way to the social instability of Hegel's in their respective modes of thinking. After Hegel's death, the German philosophical scene fell into chaos. In one camp, there were the Hegelians, which themselves split into a right and a left wing, depending on whether they considered the kernel of Hegel's thought to be its hermeticity or its contradiction. In any case, the Hegelians were pro-systematic. Counted among the Hegelians are people like David Strauss, Ludwig Feuerbach, and Karl Marx. The other camp, the anti-Hegelians, insofar as many of the previous camp are not also anti-Hegelian, were much more disparate, but unified at least in one thing. They deemed Hegel's attempt to rationally derive an absolute system of truth as misguided, self-contradictory, and at worst, self-serving. These thinkers, including the likes of Arthur Schopenhauer and Friedrich Nietzsche, formed the crux of a radical shift in philosophy towards anti-order. At almost the exact same time as German philosophy was fracturing along pro- and anti-systematic lines, the same was happening in German music. This is no wonder, since we have already established that art is nothing but an abstraction built on top of philosophy, however imperfectly that abstraction might represent its medium. As many of you are already aware, the War of the Romantics, as it came to be known, pitted the so-called conservatives, centered in Leipzig around Brahms, the Schumanns, Joseph Joachim, and a few other spiritual disciples of Felix Mendelssohn, against the so-called radical progressives, also known as the New German School, who were centered in Weimar around Liszt and Wagner. Where the Hegelians saw system as being the goal of philosophy, albeit in strongly differing ways, the musical conservatives essentially saw their own subject matter in the same light. Brahms, for example, was meticulously concerned about formal systematic cohesion. From the musical estates of Beethoven and Bach, he inherited the preoccupation with motivic derivation and constant movement. Wagner derisively labeled this kind of music as absolute music, lampooning the absolute idealism of the then unfashionable Hegel. Meanwhile, the New German School fell much more in line with the anti-Hegelians, like Schopenhauer. Wagner certainly understood form, but his principal focus was the development of music according to the demands of the content of the Gesamtkunstwerk, the total artwork. Motives were not things in themselves, but things of others, which needed not to have any necessary internal connection with one another. In contrast to Brahms, he inherited the tendency of Beethoven towards a style which is all-encompassing because of scope and scale. Out of the musicians who were drawn into the War of the Romantics, only Wagner really clearly articulated a conscious philosophical, ideological, or political goal with his music, but even assuming it was an unconscious matter for the others, it was still a part they played in the larger drama. Every polar opposite is inadequate by itself. Both the conservative and the radical progressive camps contained their opposites within themselves. For example, nobody can analyze Brahms's music harmonically and come away with the impression that he was not extremely forward-looking, just as much as one cannot watch a Wagner production without seeing the complete realization of the goals of the Florentine Camerata all the way back from the beginning of the 17th century. Such points of similarity are easily overlooked when one is searching only for distinctions between one thing or another, just as easily as irreconcilable differences can be overlooked when one wants to find only common shifts. But sooner or later, from whichever side one approaches the matter, identity and difference reassert themselves in force. Since it achieved sapience, humanity has been constantly striving to overcome its own bestiality. The impetus for this is clear. Under the limitations imposed by a purely animal existence, humanity could not possibly realize its full potential as an intellectual species. It develops its productive forces further and further so as to create a wider and wider foundation on which to build its edifices of art, culture, philosophy, religion, politics, and other institutions we consider to exist on a higher level. Finding only limitations in the material world of difference, it denies its vulgar existence in search of the divine, the limitless. But this can only ever be a one-sided negative infinity. When humanity erected civilization, it alienated itself from the real world of things. We can see now the consequences of this search for difference at the expense of identity. Through millennia, nature has been reasserting her identity with humanity violently. In our quest for a civilized life, we treat one another with less respect than wild animals do each other. In our reshaping the environment to suit our own needs, it now poses an even greater threat to civilized life than anything else before it. In our quest for safety, plague death knocks down our doors. This is not to say that we must negate our differences with the rest of the natural world, to abolish our art and our culture. The forecast in this case would be just as catastrophic. Rather, we must find difference from nature in our identity with nature. We must make our real existence correspond with our rational being. As artists working on the highest level of abstraction from life as such, it is our responsibility to make our art correspond with its natural concept, just as much as it is for all society to address the unsustainability of its present mode of life. To be aware of limitations is already to be beyond them. Thank you.